Hello and welcome to another Times Radio recap. Now we've got some fantastic videos for you this week, and I urge you to go to our channel and watch everything. But the week has been influenced by Russian drones flying into Poland. Here's what Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, has to say about it.
Allies expressed solidarity with Poland and denounced Russia's reckless behavior. A full assessment of the incident is ongoing. What is clear is that the violation last night is not an isolated incident. The Supreme Allied Commander will continue to actively manage our deterrence and defense posture along the entire eastern flank. Allies are resolved to defend every inch of Allied territory. We will closely monitor the situation along our eastern flank, our air defences continually at the ready.
Now, Mark Rutte was publicly condemning what the Russians have done and talking about the instigation of Article 4 of NATO's constitution. Article 4 is not one step below Article 5. Article 5, an attack on one, is deemed an attack on all. Article 4 is basically an expansion of a diplomatic stiff letter to someone who has violated a NATO country. And instead of it coming from one country, i.e. the Poles in this case, to Vladimir Putin in Moscow, delivered by his ambassador, it's coming collectively from all of NATO members who will collectively sign a good telling off and good British stiff letter that will go to Vladimir Putin, lifting things up from a diplomatic perspective to a much higher level and showing that collective response, which should send Putin quite a strong message. And of course, one of the major contributing members of NATO is the United Kingdom. And here's what John Healey had to say about it at the Defence and Security Exhibition International in London this week.
As your NATO ally, we will support you, our Polish friends. As your NATO ally, we will play our part to help secure the safety of your people. And following our discussions today, I've asked our UK armed forces to look at options to bolster NATO's air defence over Poland.
And John is talking about getting British military commanders to work out what the UK can send to enhance Poland's air defence capability. But of course, across the whole of the NATO front line, Russia could threaten. So this is something that I think NATO will be focusing on, trying to provide an air defence capability. And when we look at what was used to shoot down the drones are $10,000 drones. The anti-aircraft missiles that were launched from F-35 aircraft come in at over $1 million a piece. There's a question mark as to the economic viability of doing this, and therefore less expensive methods of shooting relatively slow, relatively easy to spot drones down, should that need to happen, is something that will be at the forefront of different governments. But this was almost certainly, from my perspective, Putin testing NATO's response and Poland's response, and using it to send messages to his own population and elsewhere. And NATO's response, a collective response, both from a military perspective to deal with the immediate threat, and now from a political perspective, is sending Vladimir Putin a very strong message back. Now, we talk about Putin in our videos that I'm going to point you out this week. And the first one was at that very DSEI exhibition in London, me sitting down and talking to Robert Fox.
The apprehension about Russia, I think it's there, and I think it's quite limited. Historically, it's quite limited, because the thing is, along with climate change, the other migration and movement, and is utterly related. It's the demographic autumning of the whole planet, which when you see almost all United Nations, all its agencies, predict that come 80 years' time, only 6 nations on Earth will have a sustainable population. They'll be huge, they'll grow, but then they start declining, and they start declining big time. Now, this is very much affecting Britain now. I work with Italian demographers, follow the stats in the Netherlands, partly because of my domestic circumstances, but it's the most developed economy just about in Europe, therefore, of a sophisticated economy in the world, and look at the pressures going on there. The sort of things where the alarm bells have really rung, that Greece and South Korea are facing something I never thought I'd see in such a case, demographic collapse.
Yep.
Within a generation. Greece could go from just over 10 million to just over 3 in 75 years. And that's disastrous, the pressure. Relate that in Scotland is feeling, and Wales is feeling it here, but also the question of employment, which has been stalking these halls as we come to this thing. It's very, very difficult because when you get demographic decline, I won't go into it, it's a separate program. It's very interesting because the effect is not necessarily direct, it's not obvious. Suddenly you find lots of young people very reluctant to think about work at all, is one of the things. Back to Russia. The demographic crisis, yes, it's in slow decline, the population. More dramatic, Ukraine is in decline. But it's the quality. It's the quality of the population. You look at the steady fall of life expectation of adults, and it's going down and down and down, and it's health. This is why the sensible side of Putin, he's a hypochondriac, we know, but was really worried about the effect of COVID. And he really, I think that secretly he sees a very, very unhealthy population to the extent of disgusting things, if I can do it, because it was something I was surprised of by a British chief, but we'll keep quiet about that the Ukrainians were worried about the effect on morale of these battalions of the write-offs.
Yes.
That is, the write-offs with hepatitis C and with AIDS, and it's true. And this is what has happened. The casual approach, official approach to disease and decay in Russia, of course, it's not what we see from the streets of St. Petersburg or Rostov or of Moscow, but it's bound to hit. Since we're on this, I think it's very, very important to see why Putin, the Putin regime, was so threatened by Alexei Navalny. What was he doing? He was campaigning way out in the east.
Yeah.
And what he spotted was how unpopular the apparatchiks sent in to be governors, to be elected as governors in these utterly fixed elections, were from Moscow, that they didn't like them. And the fear is, to coin a phrase, it's been around since the 100 Years' War, they fear, as indeed you get it in parts of France, this thing known as a jacquerie. Jacquerie is a spontaneous explosion against the authorities with no particular leadership, because it was Jacques in the 100 Years' War, and with no particular program, but it is, I'm fed up, stuff this, stuff you. And Putin and Xi spotted this in the Coloured Revolution. These spontaneous explosions across China are not unknown, where you suddenly wake up in the morning, you find half the municipal governors hanging from outside the mayoralty and things like that. I exaggerate, but that has been recorded in 2 or 3 cases, and it's what's happening. And so I've been very long-winded, coming around to a point. Yes, the fragmentation of Russia and why it will happen from an unexpected trigger point and will have very unexpected results because, of course, it will feed sheer criminality globally.
Now, Robert has got an amazing understanding of the subtleties behind the geopolitics of everything that's going on, the subtleties behind how global leaders and global commentators are interpreting things. And he delves into some of the fears behind Vladimir Putin and the state of the Russian economy and the pressure points that can be put on Putin, but also the pressure points that are hitting some of Putin's supporters, whether they be tacit supporters from within NATO countries or they be other supporters around the world, and how that geopolitics is likely to play out. This is a fantastic interview, and Robert gives insights that many other people can't really begin to understand, and it's always a pleasure talking to him. The next interview I want to point you at is with an old friend and colleague, Hamish de Bretton Gordon, a former colonel in the British Army. He commanded the British Army's nuclear, biological, chemical warfare defence regiment and is a former tank commander.
In British Army terms, albeit a peacetime training cycle, it takes 2 years to train a formation from being able to operate each individual piece of equipment to being able to fight together, integrating all of the pieces of equipment. How big a challenge is that for the Ukrainians to try and learn that with new kit whilst they're fighting a high intensity conflict? And should we be surprised that they're not in a position to fight armoured formations in the way that we would traditionally believe?
Yeah, I mean, almost impossible. Training in contact, as it were, is hugely challenging. Combined arms manoeuvre warfare, as you say, it's not just the tanks, it's the infantry, it's the dismounted infantry, it's the artillery, it's the drones, it's combining with air. It takes time. When we trained for Gulf War II, we trained for a year of combined arms operation after we'd done all our individual training. So trying to do that in contact. Now, the Ukrainians, when they had their Kursk manoeuvre back in the summer of last year, did manage to get a sort of a battle group size capability out of the line and train it. And they were really effective. Some of the operations there, going across minefields, doing obstacle crossings and actually taking ground and moving quickly, were phenomenal. But then we're talking about a battle group. We're talking about 1,000 men at most, not we're talking about brigades of 5,000 or so. So yeah, I mean, it is hugely, hugely challenging. People will say, what about the British Army? Well, we are doing this, and we have high readiness brigades that are actually trained in combined arms manoeuvre warfare, starting to integrate drones and all the other type of things that could operate, but that has taken a heck of a long time. So to expect Ukraine to do anything dramatic, I think is, we're not going to see it. What we should be learning from them, and particularly in your area, Phil, some of the special operations that they've done, some of the deep strategic strikes using their special forces and security services are phenomenal. And let's hope that we are also learning from those, although I expect we probably pretty much know how to do that sort of stuff anyway.
Yes, the one thing I haven't found here is a special operations executive zone where it teaches you how to create all these...
You just can't see them, Phil.
Well, of course you can't see them. That means that they're doing a very, very good job. But, it's fascinating. Getting back to what's happening on the front line, we keep hearing about a Russian further counteroffensive in the summer. And the Ukrainians are being very quiet, but there seems to be a lot going on. Do you think the Russians have got the ability to create mass and to try and punch through the front lines at the minute? Do you think the Ukrainians have got the ability to do that, or are we going to see a stalemate in the east that seems to have been there for quite some time, even though the Russians are advancing a few tens of meters here, the Ukrainians a few tens of meters there?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I personally don't think the Russians have the ability to conduct operations much bigger than sort of company level, maybe 100 at a time. And when you've got a front of 900 miles, that's pretty small. And I don't think they have the ability to reinforce it, because whenever they have punched through a couple of kilometers, they've lost it almost straight away. So, yeah, I don't think the Russians do have the ability to do much more than just sort of hang on. And the MOD intelligence update the other day suggested that if the Russians took the whole of the Donbass, it would cost them 2 million men and take them 4 years. And, that is probably, a pretty good marker. As far as the Ukrainians are concerned, again, they really don't necessarily have the ability to do that. What I'd say with one hopeful hat on, their deep operations, what are their deep operations? What are the planning for that? I think they could do something significant, because if you can really hit the enemy, where it really hurts them in the rear, to use sort of Slim's great wordage, then, they may be able to, not say take great swathes of land, but really make the Russians think again and look around. So I think generally we're not going to see great movement across the front lines. I think we might see a few spectaculars, and let's hope so. After Op Spider's Web last year and the operations to take out the oil industry in Russia, most people are queuing for a day to get fuel now. and they're getting a bit hacked off by it. So I think that continuation but the ability to create mass, I don't think so. And I would hope that Western intelligence is giving the Ukrainians a really good feed that if there is any build-up, but I don't see it. I personally believe the Russian army has culminated, run out of steam, and without taking itself out of the line for a few years, which is sort of one of the, a lot of other analysts like you and me, Phil, are suggesting that's what Putin wants to do. Let's have a break here for 4 or 5 years, reconstitute, and then go again. So, which is why it's frustrating. I think it's such an opportunity for Trump and the West to actually go, yeah, you've culminated. This is a real chance to sue for peace. But again, as we know, Putin exploits weakness and respects strength. And at the moment, we're not really showing the strength that would get him to the negotiation table.
And in talking to Hamish, again, we were standing behind a British Army Challenger 3 tank at DSEI in London. Hamish had a big smile on his face the whole way through, because being that close to a tank brings real fond memories back. And he was describing the tank as probably the best that there is in the world once it rolls out. But we weren't talking about that. We were talking about training and the importance of training and the complexity of training, not just training the crews on how to operate an individual tank, but how difficult it is to get the crews to work with other tanks and then to work with armoured infantry and to start build up your force package, and how long that actually takes. And it's this training bit that people fail to recognise. And it's, we hear lots of cries coming out in the press that we should have just given Ukraine lots of kit and they'd have got on with it and they'd have pushed the Russians back. Listen to what Hamish has to say and what we both have to say, because just giving people kit will result in that kit being destroyed. If you don't know how to operate it, but more importantly, you don't know how to fight it, and even more importantly, don't know how to fight it collectively with everything else that comes together in the complexity of a modern battlefield, then you will lose that kit, no matter how good each individual piece is. So can't commend that interview to you more highly. And then finally, the third one this week is me talking to Professor Scott Lucas. What's your reading of where we are at the moment?
The easiest way for me to deal with this, Philip, is to actually put the headlines to one side to start off with. What has the Donald tweeted lately? What has Vlad come out with, and out of the Kremlin? How's she doing in Beijing, welcoming everybody there and enjoying all that discounted oil, by the way, that he's getting. And okay, let's take it step by step. All right, if we take it in terms of the Russian invasion, let's say this flat out. Look, that Russian invasion is going to continue beyond day 1300 and well beyond. So all this talk about a ceasefire and going round and round about this, and we'd love to get a ceasefire, and we support efforts to get a ceasefire, but the Kremlin's not going to accept it. And they've signaled they're not going to accept it. And the latest stunt here was Putin says to Zelensky, who he doesn't recognize as legitimate, oh, yeah, I'll talk to you, but you come over here and you sit here in the Kremlin, along with all my other listening devices here, right? And you may or may not get out again. And Zelensky knows what the ruse is, so he tells U.S. media, because he's playing to Trump over the weekend, well, we'll just have Vlad come to Kyiv, and welcome him there. So let's put all that to the side and say, all right, well, where are the Russians with the invasion? And where are they going? So the headline is, again, the record-setting drone attacks that took place on Sunday. I'll get to that in just a second. But I just want to emphasize on that front line, they're not achieving that breakthrough. And that's the key thing, because a lot of the media, you'll know this as an expert, military expert, it's hard for those who aren't in on this day-to-day to just drop in and say, how's that frontline war going? They want a big, dramatic win or lose story. If we look at Crimea, okay, the Russians have Crimea. If you look in the south, very little has moved in Zaporizhia or Kherson. There was a flutter that, the Russians were going to cross into Dnipropetrovsk region. That was an incursion. That doesn't go anywhere. All right, so we go to the east, and the big action is in the Donetsk region, right? Russians have 75%. Ukraine's got 25%. How are the Russians doing there? And again, correct me on this. I'm going to go back to this, but my tally is that since May 23, which was when Bakhmut fell, they have taken 4 towns and only 4 towns in Donetsk. I know Vuhledar, Avdiivka, and a couple others. That's been it, right? Now, they may take some villages, they may expand gradually the area of control, but they haven't made that big breakthrough in Donetsk. And of course, why is that important? That 25% of Ukraine of Donetsk that Ukraine holds is the fortified belt. And we know that that is the key in terms of where we land if this invasion ever halts, in terms of who controls that 25. And the Russians aren't getting it at this point, right? Nor have the Russians been able to establish that foothold in Sumy and in Kharkiv, which they've been trying to get. And indeed, if you buy what the Ukrainians saying, and I think I do, they've gradually regained some territory up there. And by the way, for what it's worth, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Syrskyi, is saying that they've regained territory in Donetsk in the past few days as well, around Pokrovsk. We'll see what that means. Effectively, I go back to something that I learned a couple of weeks ago, and I introduced it with you and colleagues at times. I learned from Deep State, which is a very good monitoring organization. November 22, Russians have 18% of Ukraine under occupation. August 2025, the Russians have 19% of Ukraine under occupation. They have taken 1% of Ukraine in almost 3 years, right? And for fans of Blackadder Goes Forth, if you want to talk about General Melchett and so on, I recommend to do it. When he presents the amount of territory that British troops have regained in their dramatic offensive, he puts a small block about 1 foot by 1 foot of turf on the table. And somebody says, well, what's the scale of that? What's the scale of that? And he says, it's 1 to 1. We took 1 foot of territory. Well, hello, Vlad. You could be doing the same thing on your giant table in the Kremlin, for all we know. All right. So that takes us to the attacks on civilians and energy infrastructure. And here's a key link that you make. If Vlad and the boys thought they were winning on the front line at Donetsk, they wouldn't be running the record drone and missile attacks on the rest of Ukraine. They wouldn't need to. But because they're not making the gains there, he's got to step it up in terms of trying to break the will of Ukrainians to resist.
Now, Scott is looking at the wider geopolitics. And it's the wider geopolitics where, in his opening line, he's saying, putting the headlines that we're seeing to one side. And again, he comes at things from a slightly different perspective to Robert, but has got this fascinating understanding of how the political nuances are working across Washington, the United States. Scott is always worth listening to. He is across the US brief on a daily basis. He's across how US policy and commentators are interpreting what's going on in Ukraine and what's likely to happen next, and where the pressure points are. And his insights are something that you need to really watch. You'll see small snippets of each of those interviews presented here, but I really recommend you go back and watch the whole interviews. So that's all for this week's recap. Please remember, if you want to get exclusive access to Times Radio Frontline, please sign up for membership. It also allows you to put points out or questions out for me to answer in our weekly question and answer session. And of course, you can get us on your favourite podcast outlet. Just search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.